Before we begin this week's episode of the Grow Your Wealthy Mindset podcast, I want to tell you of a great guide that I made just for you. It's the 12 financial mistakes that keep physicians from building wealth. After talking to hundreds of physicians, I've heard many mistakes, and these are the ones that I thought were most important to share so that you can potentially avoid making these mistakes, or if you've already made them, learn a bit about how you might be able to recover. You can grab the guide at my website, www.growyourwealthymindset.com/12 financial mistakes. Now on to this week's episode. Hello, welcome to the Grow Your Wealthy Mindset podcast, where it is all about helping amazing physicians just like you create a wealthy life free from burnout and with the financial security to practice medicine on your own terms. I'm your host, Dr. Elisa Zhang. Welcome back to the Grow Your Wealthy Mindset podcast. I've often mentioned on this podcast that my passion is to travel, and I've done a lot of traveling this summer, which meant batching a lot of episodes, so there is a new episode every week for you. I most recently returned from 2 weeks in Ireland, and I thought, why not talk about the finances of travel, what I spent money on, and what went into the financial decision-making as I was planning the trip. This is somewhat unscripted for me, so we'll just see how it goes. Though I will say this is the second time I'm recording this podcast episode since the first time somehow my microphone was not hooked up. All right, let's get into it. This was a 2-week trip to Ireland with 2 adults as we do not have any children. I typically plan our trips to Europe using the Rick Steves guidebook as well as doing some research online as well. I have tried using ChatGPT to help with research with traveling, but I haven't really found it all that helpful as of yet. I really like how Rick Steves lays out his itineraries and how to plan spending your time. I bought our tickets on United since I do fly for work and primarily fly United, which has given me status on United. I'm currently 1K Premier, which gives me access to United lounges, as well as being able to choose the premium economy seats when I book an economy flight. It also helps to keep my status by using United for my leisure travel as well as my work travel. Since last year, I just made it to 1K with the very last flight of the year, which was my flight to New Zealand. I decided to fly United to Ireland, even though there's actually a direct flight using Aer Lingus from Cleveland to Dublin. But that flight was also more expensive than the flight on United. I initially bought our flights on December 15, 2024 for $1,134 a person. Later, there was a scheduling change, so I actually had the option of canceling my flight for a refund. I looked up new flights and how much they were costing at the time, and there must have been some kind of sale on flights because I found a flight with a better schedule than the one I booked that actually cost less. So I went ahead and canceled the original flight, got a refund, and bought a new flight on May 25th of this year for $989 per person. I see it as a win whenever I can buy a flight to Europe for less than $1,000 over the summertime. With my 1K status, I get PQP points for upgrades, so I did make a request to upgrade to Polaris Business Class for the flight from Newark to Dublin, which is the overnight flight. And luckily, we actually did get that upgrade, so I was really excited for that. This is my first time actually flying Polaris Business Class. The other thing for this trip is I knew that I wanted to stay overnight in a castle. Rick Steves in his guidebook recommends a lot of hotels, typically mom and pop kind of solo owner hotels, though there are some chain hotels in there. He doesn't typically recommend castle hotels for I don't know what reason, but when I was in Germany a few years ago, I realized as we were doing our trip that we could have actually stayed in a castle. And so I wanted to make sure that that was part of our Ireland trip. I looked up different castle hotels online and found one that was in a good location with the planned itinerary that I had already put together using the Rick Steves guidebook. I ended up booking the Ballyseed Hotel, which is near Tralee and is by the Ring of Kerry and the Dingle Peninsula. That started out as our most expensive lodging. It was 320 euros per night, which comes out to around $350 US. During our trip, the conversion rate was about €1 was equivalent of $1.18. In the course of planning the details of our trip and the activities we wanted to do. One of the activities that was really recommended in the Rick Steves guidebook was a hawk walk at Ashford Castle. I went to the website of Ashford Castle and realized that you can actually stay there. And it's actually one of the premier hotels in the world, castle or not. Looking at the pictures of the castle, I fell in love. It just looked like such a beautiful property, and there were so many activities available on the site. They even have a lake by the castle. I looked into some reviews and decided that I wanted to make the splurge to stay here, even though it came with a pretty high price tag. One night at the Ashford Hotel came out to be 995 euros for the lowest price room, and it certainly goes up from there. I will admit I hemmed and hawed a little bit. That is a little bit much for a hotel room, but in the end, I decided just to go for it. If you love luxury experiences, I highly recommend staying at Ashford Castle if you ever end up deciding to go to Ireland. It really is a beautiful castle surrounded by beautiful grounds, and the service is amazing. I only have wonderful things to say about it. For our other hotels, I booked a mix of bed and breakfasts as well as 3 and 4 star hotels. When I was looking at what hotel to book, I really prioritized location as well as ability to have parking as we would have a rental car. I often want good value, so I'm not necessarily getting the cheapest place, but I want some place nice for a good price. I do have a lot of Chase points, which do transfer to Hyatt. I also have Hilton Diamond status and have a lot of Hilton points from actually staying at Hilton hotels from my traveling while I work. Most of Ireland is really composed of small towns that don't have a Hyatt or Hilton branded hotel. Of course, there are Hyatt and Hilton hotels in Dublin, and I did look at potentially staying at those hotels. But in the end, I decided to stay at Trinity College because I really thought that would be a more unique experience. Trinity College turns some of its dorm rooms into guest rooms during the summer. These rooms have their own bathroom and also have a shared kitchen and common area, which also is really a nice amenity. And Trinity College is really located right in the heart of Dublin, so great location. At that point, we wouldn't have the rental car anymore, but they do actually even offer parking. Every place that we stayed at did offer breakfast, but with some of the hotels, it was included with the reservation. And with other hotels, you could actually just book the room itself and it was extra for the breakfast. And the extra was typically around 15 euros, which for me is more than I really want to spend on breakfast, to be honest. At home, I don't eat breakfast. I do intermittent fasting. And even when I travel, I don't tend to eat like a large breakfast. That being said, if there is a breakfast that's included, I will eat whatever looks appetizing. But it doesn't make sense for me to spend on breakfast when I'm really not wanting to eat a whole lot of it. On the other hand, my husband really needs to have breakfast in order to have energy and actually like function in the morning. So what we do is we actually just hit up a local grocery store and we'll get breakfast foods, which we can easily eat in our room. I think a lot of people, when they're on vacation, don't think about going to grocery stores to get food unless they're renting an Airbnb that has its own kitchen and they're planning on cooking. I found that getting food at grocery stores for snacks, breakfasts, and picnic lunches can really be quite convenient and potentially save money as well. When I'm traveling, I'm a go, go, go type of person, which you will soon learn as I go through what we did on this trip. And I don't necessarily want to take the time to stop and have a sit down lunch at a restaurant. Especially when we're doing scenic drives, it really makes sense to have a picnic lunch since you don't even really know when you're going to be hungry and be able to stop for a place to eat and how busy restaurants will be at different small towns during the scenic drive. One place I found that was great in Ireland was a store called Mark and Spencer's. They actually are more of a like department store, but they have a food area where they have a lot of prepared foods like salads, poke bowls, wraps, sandwiches, and even things like bean salad and pasta salads. There was really quite a variety, and so I tried many of their foods and they were actually quite tasty as well. I booked all of our lodging in advance. Outside of Dublin and exclusive of the castle hotels, our lodging ranged from about 150 US dollars to 230 US dollars per night. Dublin was a little pricier than the other towns in Ireland. The Trinity College was 230 euros a night, which comes out to be about $270. We ended up spending a total of $4,092 on hotels and lodging, and that includes the castle hotels, which makes for an average of $292 per night. And of course, that average was significantly increased by those castle hotel stays, especially when you consider that staying at Ashford Castle cost almost $1,200 for that one night. I reserved a rental car in advance. We got the rental car for 12 days, and the base rate was $595. There were additional taxes and fees, so in the end, it came out closer to $726. There was a fee to take the car up into Northern Ireland, and we also did a one-way drop-off. We picked up the car at Dublin Airport right after we landed, and then we dropped off the car in the city of Dublin. I'll review our total transportation expenses later. I did book several activities in advance, but I'll go through the activities as I go through the trip itself. The entrance fees in Ireland were actually really quite reasonable. We got a heritage card, which was €40 per person, and that allowed entry into many of the sites we saw in Ireland. It was well worth it for our 2 weeks in Ireland. Had we paid for each site separately, we would have spent way more than €40. I think I calculated out that with the sites I wanted to see, we would spend around €60. And then that also allowed us to just go ahead and see some sites that we might not have necessarily seen otherwise, since it was free entry. Most of the entrance fees not covered by the Heritage Card were around €10 to €15 per person. So now that I've gone through all the initial cost and planning, let's actually talk about the trip itself. So our plan was we were going to fly into Dublin and then pick up our rental car right away. And then we would start going around the island in a clockwise fashion, ending in Dublin and dropping off our car in Dublin, since you don't really need a car when you're actually in Dublin. I live on the east side of Cleveland, and so we flew Cleveland to Newark and then Newark to Dublin. For international flights, I really like to have at least a 3-hour layover before the actual international flight. Most flights from the United States to Europe are essentially red-eyes, where you're flying overnight and you leave in the early evening or even late evening from the United States and end up landing in the morning in Europe. As I mentioned earlier, we did get upgraded to Polaris Business Class, which means that when we're in Newark, we could actually go to the Polaris United Lounge, which I was also excited about. This was my first time at a Polaris United Lounge, and I was excited to see how it was different from a typical United Lounge. Having my United status, when I fly international, we can go to a United Lounge without having to have membership or pay anything. So I have visited several United Lounges, including the United Lounge in Newark in the past. The Newark United Lounge actually recently had just opened up a restaurant within the lounge, so we did get to try that out. When you go to the restaurant, you actually get seated at a table and food is brought to you by waitstaff. They have a limited menu with about 3 options for an appetizer, entree, and dessert. And so you order and they bring out the food. Doesn't cost anything. It's just part of the experience of being in the lounge. And so that was really nice. The portions were on the smaller side, which was good because then we didn't feel overstuffed. Then, of course, there's the buffet food in the lounge itself. And I will say that the food in the lounge itself, in the buffet, had more choices and was probably a little better than in a typical United Lounge. I don't personally drink alcohol, but from what I understand, there is more premium alcohol offered in Polaris lounges. The lounge was actually still pretty busy and even felt a little crowded. When we first arrived, it was less crowded and we got a nice seat, but then we had to leave our seat in order to go to the restaurant. And then when we came back out of the restaurant, it was a little harder to find a seat. I mean, we still found a nice place to sit, but it wasn't quite as nice as what we had when we first arrived. I would say that the lounge is nice, but just maybe a little nicer than a typical United Lounge. And I can't say I was completely wowed by it. Our flight to Dublin from Newark was slightly delayed because of the incoming flight being delayed. When they started the boarding process, they actually didn't allow those in Polaris Business Class to board because they were actually still getting set up and clean and ready. We did finally get to our seats, and they are nice lie flat seats. You're kind of in these little pods, and there's a big screen. They actually have earphones that aren't buds, but actually like large muffs around your ears. There's a little space where you can put some of your things, but there's not like space for a bag under the seat in front of you. So that would go up in the overhead bin, but there's plenty of overhead bin space. We had two pods that were next to each other in that middle section, but our pods were the ones that angled out towards the aisle. So we only had a little space where we could actually bring down the wall and try to talk to each other. So it was actually kind of hard to talk to each other during the flight. Had we been in the row ahead of us or the row behind us, then there would have been a bigger wall that could have come down and we would have been able to see each other a lot better. So I don't remember when I got upgraded and I went to go select our seats. If those type of seats were available, it might have even been better to select like two aisle seats so that we could talk to each other a little easier. And I suppose I could have done more research on that when I was picking our seats within Polaris United. But again, I don't even remember what was available and how many options there were for two people next to each other. The flight from New York to Ireland is rather short. It was like 6 or 7 hours. And so that really didn't give a whole lot of time for sleeping. I probably should have skipped dinner and just tried to go sleep right away, but our flight left early enough that I wasn't necessarily that tired yet either. And I did want to try the food on the plane. So I did have the dinner and even woke up for the breakfast. So I probably slept around 3 hours. It was comfortable, but definitely not as comfortable as sleeping in an actual bed. It probably would have been really great for a longer flight. I definitely appreciate the experience, but I honestly don't think I'd pay the cash price for Polaris Business Class for such a short flight in the future. Even though we ended up being a little delayed on takeoff, we did end up landing on time. When we arrived at the airport, I looked into the price of getting a Vodafone SIM card, which turned out to be around 40 euros. And that was a little bit more than I was expecting. I typically like to get a local SIM card if I can, since that actually allows me to make calls and I could call restaurants or hotels if I need to during the course of our trip. Because it was 40 euros, I decided to forego getting an actual SIM card that allowed talk and text and just get an eSIM card, which is data only. I love getting eSIM cards. They're really easy. I did it on the airport's Wi-Fi and got my husband and I eSIM cards from Airalo. That's AIRALO. That were $9 for 3 gigs over 30 days. Of course, that's a much better deal than paying Verizon $10 a day for international use. It's a travel hack I recommend to everyone. eSIM cards are super cheap and a great way to stay connected. You can still actually make phone calls using things like Google Voice or WhatsApp, and a lot of places in Europe do use WhatsApp. We went and picked up our rental car, and then we drove south to Kilkenny, which we arrived at Kilkenny around 10 a.m. It was nice that it was a Sunday, so street parking was free. We parked the rental car near town and just started exploring. We walked to Kilkenny Castle, which is actually where we bought the heritage card, and then we walked around town and had lunch. I did a 2:30 tour of the Roth House and Gardens, which I really enjoyed. Nathan at that point was pretty tired, so he actually opted to go back to the car and take a nap. Once I was done with our tour, we headed to our bed and breakfast, got checked in, and then both of us took naps. We did get up for dinner and we headed to Matt the Miller, which was a recommendation from our host at our bed and breakfast. They actually had live music from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. and we arrived around 7 p.m. We were actually able to get a table right away and have live music with dinner, which was great. I really enjoyed Irish music. It was a lot of fun. After dinner, we went for a stroll along the river and then head back to our bed and breakfast. I'm super lucky in that both my husband and I don't really experience a lot of jet lag. I reset to the sun very easily, and we were both tired enough that despite our afternoon nap, we went to sleep that night and the next morning got up and were ready to go on our new Europe time zone. After having a lovely breakfast at the bed and breakfast, we left Kilkenny and headed for the Rock of Cashel. That entrance fee was also covered by the Heritage Card, though we did have to pay for parking. After the Rock of Cashel, we stopped at Ashford Castle, also covered by the Heritage Card. That was also a fun castle to visit. It's used a lot for movies because of how well preserved it is. We also stopped at a grocery store in order to get some snacks for the next few days. If I had decided to go to Blarney Castle, that would have been our next stop, but I decided to actually skip it. The idea of standing in line to kiss a stone that a whole bunch of other people had recently kissed just didn't really quite appeal to me. Instead, we took Rick Steves' advice and we headed to the seaside villages of Cobb, followed by Kinsale, with a visit to Charles Fort. We had a really nice early dinner at Kinsale. Our breakfast that morning had been large enough that we actually didn't feel that hungry for lunch. So I think we just ate some snacks that we had purchased from the grocery store. And then after dinner, we drove to Killarney, where we actually spent the night. When we arrived in Killarney, we checked into our hotel. It was the Earl's Court Hotel, and that was a really nice place to stay as well. We had heard on the radio, because my husband likes to listen to the local radio when we travel, if it's in English, that the Kerry team won the Irish soccer championships, or what they call football, we call soccer. The receptionist at the desk for the hotel when we checked in actually let us know that the soccer team from the Kerry team was actually going to be in the downtown area of Killarney that night because that was their home team and that there would be a celebration. We decided to go and check it out. And there was a really festive air, and there was kind of a little bit of a parade as the buses with the soccer team kind of rolled through the main street of town with everyone on the streets like waving and cheering. And then the buses pulled into the main parking lot at the center of town, and there was basically a party. It was really fun to kind of take part of a local festivity that was really not for tourists, but really for the people in the region of Kerry. So the next day, we're now on Tuesday, we had a lovely breakfast at our hotel, and then we headed to Muckross Abbey. In Ireland, there's a lot of abbeys and monasteries that are in ruins because way back in medieval times, King Henry VIII broke off from the Catholic Church and started the Church of England in order to be able to get his divorce from Catherine of Aragon so that he could marry Anne Boleyn. King Henry VIII seized a lot of the church lands and took them from himself and, granted them to people who were his supporters. And so a lot of the religious buildings kind of ended up falling into ruin. It's really interesting to kind of visit these ruins. They're rather peaceful and also make for some interesting photography. They're also typically free to see as well. After visiting the Abbey, we headed to Muckross House and Gardens, since I really like to tour beautiful houses and estates. We spent the rest of the day doing a scenic drive through the Ring of Kerry. We stopped at two different ring forts, and I'm probably going to mess up the pronunciation, but it was Stag Fort and Cahergol. There's a third ring fort in that area, Lia Cambual, but that was closed, so we didn't get to see that one. It was really nice to actually see two different, well-preserved, excavated ring forts so that we could see how they differ from each other. They were really actually quite impressive and awe-inspiring. So these are prehistoric structures, and these are among the largest and best preserved in all of Ireland. They're made of circular dry stone walls and were built somewhere between 500 BC and 300 AD. There's no mortar or cement that's holding it together. It's really just stacked stones, all stacked very carefully together. It's not completely clear what they were used for, but they actually look in fantastic condition and you can actually climb on them. During our scenic drive, we also went by some beaches and we had a picnic lunch that we actually bought from a food truck and visited a chocolate factory where we got a little dessert. We hiked the Kerry Cliffs and looked out that it wasn't overly windy and wasn't raining while we were actually at the cliffs. We had rain every day of our trip except for maybe 2 or 3 days. Though the rain in Ireland tends to be more of like a drizzle or even a mist and doesn't tend to be like a really heavy rainfall. So it didn't stop us from doing any activities. We ended our day by checking into the Ballyseed Castle Hotel, which really was lovely. We had dinner in their formal dining room. They have 2 or 3 different places where you can dine there. There was actually a wedding being held at the hotel that night as well, even though it was a Tuesday night, which I thought was a little interesting. And then we just spent the evening chilling at the castle. The next day, we explored the Dingle Peninsula and we did the Sleigh Head Loop Drive. Unfortunately, this was potentially the worst weather day we had on our trip. There was a lot of rain and fog, so there was actually decreased visibility, and we didn't get really the spectacular views that probably make up the Dingle Peninsula. We drove to the town of Dingle and walked around, hoping the weather would clear a bit, but it really didn't clear. So we ended up heading out on the Slate Head Loop Drive, which is a 30-mile loop drive that starts and ends in Dingle. There are several minor sites which you can see, each with its own site fee that's generally payable in cash only. Basically, the person, whoever owns that land that has the little prehistoric site on that land, charges you to go on their land to see it. There's a ring fort that's there that's not excavated. There are several beehives, and we did stop to see some of the beehives. Beehives are like little stone igloos. They're kind of actually quite cute. The Blasket Visitor Center was actually unfortunately closed due to a power outage that would have been covered by the Heritage Card as well. But you could park in the parking lot, which we did, and hike out to the viewpoint. We also stopped to see the Glares Oratory, which was thought to be built 1,300 years ago and is one of Ireland's best preserved early Christian churches. We finished the loop and drove back to Dingle and then drove to Tralee, where we had a nice dinner at Tralee, and then returned to the Ballyside Castle hotel room. The Ballyside Castle Hotel is actually right next to Ballyseedy Woods, so I went for an after dinner hike through the woods, and that was actually a really lovely way to end the evening. So we got up and had our breakfast at the Ballyseed Hotel. They offer amazing breakfast that is included in the room, and then went ahead and checked out of the castle. We then made the drive to the Cliffs of Moher, which is another fantastic sight to see on the West Ireland coastline. The Cliffs of Moher are also the Cliffs of Insanity from The Princess Bride, which is my favorite movie. They've actually been used to film in many movies because of the dramatic landscape there. When we got there, it was pretty cloudy, and then it started raining, so we ended up ducking into the visitor center. But luckily after that, the rain cleared a bit, and we actually got some patches of blue skies. So we ended up staying there for about 2 hours or so that we could actually look at everything that we saw while it was cloudy with the blue skies again, since I wanted to retake some pictures. After the Cliffs of Moher, we headed to an area called the Burren. The Burren, which literally means rocky place, is a limestone plateau with a unique ecosystem. 70% of Ireland's wildflowers are actually found in the Burren. The area is really so much rock that it's rare to have really large plants like trees because the roots just can't get deep enough to support a large plant. We went to Burren Perfumery, which really is a gem of a place to go. I wouldn't have found that without reading Rick Steves' guidebook. The perfumery has a delightful cafe where we had lunch, and we were also able to catch their afternoon tour. They have lovely gardens to walk through as well. Burren Perfumery makes soaps out of all natural ingredients, as well as different fragrances and scents. We got to see the process of soap making. They also make candles. We visited the Polnabron Dolmen, which hundreds of years ago the locals would actually call a druid's altar. It's actually thought to be 5,000 years old and is what remains of a portal tomb. That was also a great area to actually walk on the Burren and experience just how rocky it really is. It's really like rocks everywhere with like some plant growth in between rocks. We made a stop at Dungar Castle, which was closed, but the gate was actually open, so we could still walk around the castle, and we saw a lot of other people doing it, so we did it as well. Then we headed to Galway, where we checked into our hotel. We stayed at the Suites Galway, which acts as student housing during the school year. Galway is a university town. I actually didn't realize that when I booked it. Then as we started walking around Galway, and even while we were at our hotel, we saw many people who were really dressed up, like in evening gowns or like they were dressed up from prom. It did seem like it was a lot of younger people. There were super long lines at restaurants and at pubs. We really had no idea what was going on, so we ended up talking to our hotel receptionist, and then we found out that it was actually the Galway races going on, which is a really huge event for Galway, and it was Thursday, so it was ladies' night, and that is the day where women really get dressed up. Since we didn't have any reservations at a restaurant for that evening, this was actually when we discovered Mark and Spencer's and got a whole bunch of their ready-made meals and ate them in our hotel room. which actually had a nice kitchenette, complete with dishes and silverware. So we stayed 2 nights in Galway, and during our full day, we actually headed out to the Aran Islands and took a ferry to Ismore. I booked a tour called the Wild Atlantic Experience, which took us around the island. And as opposed to other minibus tours, we were actually in a four-wheel drive, I know it was a Land Cruiser or Land Rover, but that kind of car. And it was actually run by someone who was born on the island. He actually spoke Gaelic as his first language and still speaks Gaelic with his family. His father actually happens to own the land that is next to the wormhole, which was made famous by Red Bull. So we actually got to go to his father's land, walk over to the wormhole, and have a nice area view. We went to Dun Angus, which is the main attraction on the island. It's an old stone fortress that's built on the edge of a sheer cliff. The fortress itself is really in ruins, but the scenery there is just gorgeous. I mean, it is a sheer drop right from the edge of the fort. We luckily also had some really nice weather, so it really was breathtaking. The Aran Islands off-road experience was 54 euros per person. We returned to our ferry, and then our ferry actually took us to see the other Aran Islands, just passed by it, and then took us to the cliffs of Moher so we could actually see the cliffs from the ocean view. We returned to Galway and were actually able to go ahead and get dinner at a fish and chips restaurant. We went to McDonough's. That was actually really fast service. Even though the races were still going on, it was fine. We walked around Galway a bit more before heading back to our hotel to rest for the evening. So now we're up to Saturday, August 2nd. We had breakfast in our room. So from this point forward, none of our hotels actually offered breakfast as part of the reservation. It was always something you had to pay for extra. But I didn't realize until that point that all the hotels I booked that actually included breakfast were during the first week of our trip. And then during the latter part of our trip, none of the places that we stayed at actually had breakfast included as part of the room rate. Anyway, we checked out and we headed north to do some scenic driving of the Camara area. We drove up to Westport and did a little walk around that town. Then we drove to the Dulu Valley and saw Astley Falls. We did go to Calmore Abbey, but then it started raining, so we didn't actually end up paying to see their gardens because that rain was actually pretty heavy. We had a picnic lunch for that day that we had bought from Mark and Spencer's, and we actually ended up eating it in a car sitting at an overlook of Killary Ford. We then drove through the Man Valley and arrived at Ashford Castle right at 3 o'clock for check-in time. As I mentioned before, Ashford Castle really it's actually like breathtaking. I really love it. We got checked into our room and then headed to our first activity, which was clay shooting. I have personally shot a shotgun once before at a static target, but my husband has never shot any gun before. So I thought this would be a great new experience and also seems kind of like I don't know, aristocratic experience to go clay shooting. Overall, I think we actually did pretty well. I think we kind of got, I think we were able to hit maybe about half of the clay discs that got shot out. So that was pretty cool. The clay shooting at Ashford Castle was 100 euros per person, and it was a private session for just my husband and I, so 200 euros for the two of us. Afterwards, we did explore the grounds of the castle. It was raining somewhat, but it was more of a drizzle rain at that point. And then we headed back to our hotel room in order to get cleaned up for dinner. Ashford Castle has multiple dining options. I had made a reservation at one of the more casual places to eat, which was Cullen Cottage, and they also specialize in seafood, which I really like seafood. After dinner, we spent time just actually really exploring the interior of the castle, walking through all the different hallways, passing by like every room because it's, unlike a regular hotel that every floor kind of looks the same, like all the different wings of the castle are different and they're all decorated different and it's also elegant and it's really just a beautiful place. They even have a movie theater, which was showing Top Gun, and we decided to go ahead and watch the movie in the movie theater. They had popcorn and some candy available and would bring drinks. It was really lovely. They also have an amazing breakfast buffet, definitely the best of our trip. Not only do they have the breakfast buffet, but you can also order hot food off a menu as well. I definitely overate that meal, and so we ended up skipping lunch. In the morning, we also had our hawk walk. When we arrived at the falconry, we learned how birds of prey actually are trained to work with humans to hunt. We got to see a peregrine falcon, an owl, and many hawks. We learned that they really use hawks because hawks are more social and are more willing to accept a stranger if that stranger is with someone they're familiar with, as opposed to a peregrine falcon really doesn't accept and won't really do a lot of hunting with strangers. Part of the hunting experience is that the bird will actually hunt something that's a little too big for them to carry. And so the human could take the bigger hunt and in exchange give the bird smaller pieces of meat that they can easily carry and eat away. And that's the symbiotic relationship. And that's why these birds of prey will actually work with humans to hunt together. So then we actually went on what's called a hawk walk. We walked through the castle grounds through some wooded area, and we got a big glove that we would put on our arm. And so then when we put our arm up, the hawk would actually fly to our arm in order to eat the little bit of mouse meat that we had sitting inside our gloved hand. And then when we put our arm down, it would fly away, and the hawk would just keep flying back and forth to trees and then fly towards us. It was really a lovely experience. The hawk walks are private, so we booked for just myself and my husband, and we had our falconer with us. The hawk walk was 105 euros per person, and that was our single most expensive activity, but totally worth it. It was super fun, and I really think it was my favorite experience of our whole trip. After the hawk walk, we returned to the hotel, took a shower, packed up, and checked out of our room before actually leaving the grounds. So after checkout, you don't actually have to leave. We walked around some more. We went to the village of Kong, which is really nearby. Because it's a proper castle, it has a little castle village nearby. There's a ruined abbey to see at that little town, but it really is just a very little town, just a few streets. And so it was easy to walk around town in not that much time. And then it was time to leave. I was really sad to leave, but all good things come to an end. And here's where I think I'm going to take a pause and end this particular episode. When I first recorded, I actually talked about the trip in whole, but the length of the recording is really just much longer than a typical episode of the Grow Your Wealthy Mindset podcast. And so I've made the decision to go ahead and split this into a part one and part two. So we're going to end part one now, and part two will be released in 1 week. So have a fantastic week, and I hope you'll look forward to part two of hearing about my trip to Ireland. Thank you so much for being a listener of the Grow Your Wealthy Mindset podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, I would love it if you could share it with your friends and colleagues. And now for the disclaimer. I am not a certified financial planner, accountant, or attorney, and nothing I say should be construed as professional investment, tax, or legal advice. This show is primarily for your education and entertainment. I am a physician, but I'm probably not your physician. So if you need any medical advice, please contact your own physician. Thank you. Don't forget to pick up your guide, 12 Financial Mistakes That Keep Physicians from Building Wealth. You can grab that guide at my website, www.growyourwealthymindset.com/12 financial mistakes. You'll also find that link in the show notes.